Whitney Houston did not make a habit of parading her private life in public, listing the men she dated, or turning her love life into a spectacle. Yet there was one man she was said to resent more deeply than anyone she had ever known. Not a sworn rival, not the scavenging media, but the very man she had once adored with every fragment of her heart. Bobby Brown. Behind that carefully assembled image, the flawless smile, the voice that felt almost divine, the halo of superstardom there, churned a quiet, airless storm. Inside was a place where love slowly hardened into something heavy to carry, where unspoken injuries spread like an invisible infection, becoming a silent, burning resentment that had no name yet. This was never a simple Hollywood love story. It was the slow unmaking of a legend, piece by painful piece, a dismantling that dragged her off the pedestal the world had placed her on. Before we walk into the darker corners of the secret that left so many stunned and speechless, you have to understand how the first cracks formed in a life that once looked unshakable. From the very first time the public saw them share a frame, the dissonance was impossible to ignore. On one side stood Whitney Houston, the polished symbol of purity, a supposed embodiment of the American dream, refined down to every movement, every note. On the other stood Bobby Brown, a raw, impulsive, combustible force that carried the scent of the streets and a wild, untamed instinct that refused to be softened for anyone. As the 1990s opened, Whitney moved into the decade as if destiny itself had cleared a path for her. She wasn't just famous, she felt inevitable. Her pitch was immaculate, her presence magnetic, and every move had been calibrated to satisfy what the entertainment machine demanded from a black superstar who could be welcomed into every living room in suburban America without stirring fear or controversy. But that same perfection came at a cost. It functioned like an invisible noose tightening around her inner life. The more correct she became for public consumption, the less oxygen there seemed to be for the real Whitney. And then, without warning, Bobby Brown arrived like a jagged, clashing note thrown into a perfectly tuned orchestra. He didn't ask permission. He didn't wait to be invited. And he clearly had no interest in blending in. By that time, Whitney had become more than a chart-topping vocalist. She was a symbol. She represented pride, hope, and the possibility that a black woman could be both monumental and non-threatening in the eyes of the mainstream. Her voice was treated as flawless. Her image was guarded like a national treasure. Yet away from the stage, every gesture was weighed. Her smile had to be soft but not too bold. Her words had to be sharp but never hostile. Her body language had to remain safely within the lines of what executives, handlers, and even relatives considered appropriate. Managers, family, and label heads all claimed noble reasons for protecting that image. They said they were preserving her legacy, shielding her from harm, doing what was necessary. For years, Whitney played that role with breathtaking skill. But the sensation of being smothered did not disappear. It grew quietly in the shadows while the spotlights kept blinding everyone else. When Bobby Brown entered her orbit, he did not arrive promising order structure or a stable, predictable future. Instead, he brought a rough, unfiltered kind of freedom that Whitney had never been truly allowed to touch. He was her opposite in almost every way, not only in sound, but in the very way he existed. He did not bend for public opinion. He didn't trim his edges to fit expectations. He lived by emotion, reacted on instinct, and apologized for very little, if anything. To Whitney's team, Bobby was not a mystery. He was a warning sign flashing in red. The distance between their worlds was obvious. One had been trained to place each step with precision. The other rejected the idea of being trained at all. Yet it was exactly that collision that created the magnetic pull between them. Whitney sensed something in him that few others offered. Bobby didn't stare at her like a distant, flawless icon or treat her as a commodity to be managed. He saw a woman, tired, passionate, vulnerable, curious. A woman with real hunger, real fear, and corners of her soul that had never been allowed to breathe freely. The attraction did not come from grand declarations. It began with the simple, intoxicating relief of being able to exhale, laugh, and exist without constantly performing. Their crossing at the 1989 Soul Train Music Awards wasn't a legend embroidered after the fact. It was a documented pivot point. It happened fast, unexpectedly, as if two separate trajectories suddenly bent toward each other. Those who were there said Whitney's glow that night felt different. Not the rehearsed radiance she gave to cameras and mirrors, but the light of a woman whose heart had finally found something that made it vibrate in a new, dangerous way. Yet even in those early, seemingly magical moments, people closest to her felt a shift in the air. Her family and her team, who had grown used to keeping Whitney in a safe, predictable orbit, heard a quiet alarm. These weren't just two different worlds. They were opposite poles. And when opposite orbits cross paths, the result is rarely gentle. There were subtleties from that period that rarely make it into the public retelling, but they speak volumes. According to some former members of her entourage, this was when Whitney first began to openly resist the familiar guidance she had followed for years. She insisted on choosing her own destinations, deciding who she would meet and where she would go without waiting for approval from the layers of people who had always controlled the schedule. To some, this looked like natural growth, the fair demand of a woman in her prime wanting more control over her life. But to those who knew how fragile the scaffolding behind her fame really was, it felt like the first thin crack in a dam holding back something enormous. Bobby Brown didn't create that fracture, but he stepped straight into it and pushed it wider. And Whitney, at that key moment, didn't pull away. She leaned in, as if she had been waiting her whole life for something or someone to challenge the borders she had never dared cross. From the outside, the concern circling around her did not come from random bias alone. It came from the realization that Whitney was standing at a crossroads without a clear map. The industry had spent years sculpting her into something digestible for the mainstream, especially in a landscape where a black woman chasing global superstardom had to walk a razor-thin line between admiration and harsh judgment. Bobby, in his defiant refusal to adapt, scared people, not only because of who he was, but because of the ripple effect he represented. Their union threatened to disrupt the complex structure built around Whitney's image, a machine that fed careers, reputations, and serious money. But at that point, Whitney seemed tired of feeding structures. She wanted to feel real, even if that reality came at a cost. It matters to note that in those early days, there was no open hatred, no carved-in-stone resentment, no declared bitterness. There was fascination, infatuation, and a deeply human hope that affection could somehow compensate for difference. But even within those glowing moments, seeds of disaster were quietly being planted. Differences do not vanish when people fall in love. They simply slip beneath the surface, hidden for a time by the heat of passion. Whitney walked into that relationship with an unguarded heart, but also with old wounds that had never fully healed. And Bobby Brown, whether he meant to or not, stepped right into the center of her light, carrying his own shadows alongside hers. This was not hatred yet. It was the slow tightening of fate around two people who had no idea how much the connection would cost them. Their wedding in 1992 unfolded under a wave of attention and applause. Photographs caught the smiles, the kisses, the promise of forever. But beneath the celebration, a quieter truth began to take shape. The moment their love was made official on paper was in many ways the moment an unseen cage began to slide into place. There were no bars to point at, no physical doors to slam. Yet gradually Whitney began to disappear from the place that once felt like her second home, the stage. Her withdrawal was not dramatic at first. It moved slowly, almost politely. Tour dates became less frequent. Projects that should have followed her momentum were delayed again and again. Her public appearances grew fewer than anyone would expect for an artist at the very peak of her power. These shifts were later confirmed by schedules and records, not just gossip. What those documents could not capture was the heaviness reported by people around her, the sense that the role of wife was quietly devouring the identity of artist. Meanwhile, Bobby Brown did little to hide his own turmoil. In multiple interviews over the years, He openly admitted that standing next to Whitney Houston made him feel overshadowed. It takes a certain kind of courage or bluntness to say that, and Bobby expressed it with the same rough honesty that defined him from the beginning. But those feelings didn't stay locked inside him. They seeped into the atmosphere of the marriage. A man who had once been the focal point of his own success story was now introduced first as Whitney Houston's husband. A woman who had been carrying an entire industry's expectations now had to bear another load, maintaining a household, a marriage, and an image of domestic success. These pressures did not balance each other out. They collided, grinding against each other day after day. Whitney felt responsible for keeping the family intact. On paper it sounded warm, family unity, love. In reality, for someone who had lived most of her life under relentless scrutiny and strict control, it became another form of suffocation. Those close to her began to notice that studio sessions no longer flowed with the same ease. There were days when she arrived late and others when she didn't appear at all. Sessions were cut short. Tours were postponed without explanations that truly matched her former level of discipline. According to people in her circle, these were not wild rumors. They were memories of real disruptions of momentum that kept falling apart. What unsettled them most, however, was the expression in her eyes. They looked more drained, more watchful, as if she had to evaluate every sentence before letting it leave her mouth. The smile remained for cameras, but its spontaneity was gone. It became a mask she could put on at will, while beneath it lay tightly wound feelings that had nowhere to go. At the same time, tabloids began whispering. Anonymous sources and behind-the-scenes stories multiplied, often contradicting each other, many without definitive proof. There were tales of explosive confrontations at home, of evenings where the emotional air was so tense that one wrong word could cause everything to shatter. To be precise, these stories were rumors spread by word of mouth and amplified by the press, not hard evidence. Still, rumors rarely appear from absolutely nothing. They latch onto visible changes. And in this case, the change in Whitney's demeanor was visible. The cruelest thing about an invisible cage is not just that it stops you from flying, it's that it convinces you that staying still is the noble thing to do. Whitney seemed to start regulating herself, editing her own life to prevent more conflict at home. The intense rush of early love gradually turned into a sequence of compromises. With each compromise, she let go of some piece of the freedom that had drawn Bobby to her in the first place. Ironically, this only deepened the distance between them. Bobby felt like he was losing his place at the center. Whitney felt like she was losing her sense of self. These unspoken fears accumulated, slowly fermenting into disappointment, then trauma, then a kind of silent rage that had no clear target. To the audience, she still appeared as the consummate icon. The gowns, the performances, the applause were all still there. But somewhere inside, a door was closing. Not with a dramatic slam, but with a quiet, slow finality. Silence began to spread, silence in the studio, in the middle of half-finished talks, and in the deepest part of her own mind. Her anger at this point did not erupt outward. It turned inward, eating away at her from within. She did not yet consciously hate anyone. But she was arriving at a painful realization. The love that once felt like her escape had become another kind of prison. And what made it worse was recognizing that this cage was not built by Bobby alone. It was created by two people who loved each other but never had the tools to survive their differences without breaking each other in the process. For anyone watching this unfold from a distance, the real weight of the story lies not in the sensational headlines, but in the raw human tragedy. A woman who had reached heights most people only dream of was losing herself inside her own home. The distance between how the world saw her and how she experienced herself grew into a chasm that no fan critic or outsider could fill. Whitney Houston in this chapter was neither a pure victim nor a master of her fate. She was a human being trying to reconcile love, fame, and identity in a world that refused to let her be anything less than perfect. And when love stopped being a place of refuge and turned into an invisible cage, something close to hatred began to form, not loud, not officially declared, but growing inside the tightening grip around her spirit. Her smile in those days became something eerie. It appeared precisely when it was supposed to on stage in interviews and photographs. But if you looked carefully, you could see the strain. It was no longer the easy smile of a woman standing firmly at the summit. It was the controlled expression of someone trying not to fall apart in the center of a storm. Critics started to note an inconsistency in her performances. Their reviews, for the most part, were not malicious attacks. They described something very specific. Whitney still sang beautifully. She still moved audiences. But the reliability that once defined her began to falter. Some nights her performances were explosive and emotionally stunning. Other nights they felt forced hollow, as if her body and voice were there, but some vital part of her was missing. This volatility wasn't about technical skill. It was psychological. Everyone could feel it, even if very few dared to speak it outright. Away from the crowd, Whitney seemed stretched thin, almost transparent. On one side stood the burden of family duty, a pressure with no off switch that demanded endless patience, sacrifice, and silence. On the other side was the crushing weight of fame, which offered no space for weakness and no guarantee of mercy if she stumbled. Caught between these forces was something more devastating, a profound disappointment in the man who had once been her emotional anchor. Bobby Brown would later acknowledge in his own memoirs that their relationship was chaotic and harmful for both of them. It wasn't a simple accusation against him. It was an admission that neither of them had what was needed to keep their marriage intact. But by the time those words were spoken in public, the damage inside Whitney had already settled deep. Some colleagues later recalled a chilling detail. After certain performances, Whitney would slip into long, motionless silences, as if she needed extra time, just to return to herself. This wasn't the indulgence of a diva. It was the drained stillness of someone who had just used the last of her strength to hold an image together in front of thousands of watching eyes. They remembered moments when she was intensely present, focused on every note, every breath followed by abrupt withdrawal, as though she had retreated behind a wall, even while people were still in the room. Taken alone, these moments might have seemed ordinary. But when placed in a long sequence of changes, they formed a portrait of a soul under extreme pressure. Her unraveling was not a single catastrophe. It was a slow leak, night after night, day after day. As this played out, whispers around her hardened into a new narrative. People didn't just say she was unhappy. They suggested she was harboring a deep resentment fueled by the belief that she had traded too much of herself for a marriage that never brought real peace. Again, these claims came from conversations and speculation, not official records. But they attached themselves to patterns that were very real: diminishing joint appearances, increased distance, and the guarded way Whitney reacted whenever anyone brought up her home life. She no longer responded with sharp outbursts. She chose silence, and that silence often carried more weight than any denial. The bitterness the public later projected onto Whitney did not emerge from a single explosion. It wasn't born from one dramatic betrayal. It was the result of countless small fractures layered over time, unspoken disappointments, pain swallowed to keep the peace parts of herself surrendered without getting safety in return. This wasn't wild, reckless rage. It was a quiet, lasting resentment, formed by a woman who felt she had lost too many versions of herself. She was not only let down by Bobby Brown, she was also deeply let down by her own decisions, and that kind of self-directed anger is the hardest to heal. By this stage, Whitney still stood in front of crowds, still sang, still smiled, and still embodied success for millions. But behind the scenes, the psychological storm inside her was strong enough to shake the core of who she believed she was. Her struggle was no longer only about balancing love and career. It had become a fight between enduring the pain and protecting what remained of her inner life. For anyone listening closely, the deepest ache of this story doesn't come from curiosity about gossip. It comes from recognizing the pain of a woman who had to keep smiling while slowly breaking apart. At this point, Whitney Houston seemed uncertain of what she was holding on for. The world outside her never stopped taking, never stopped asking. But the thing draining her most was right there in the space that should have been her safe harbor. And it was within that confusion that the real storm began, silent, violent and carefully hidden behind a smile, the world still chose to believe could never crack. The separation between Whitney Houston and Bobby Brown did not arrive like a clean, decisive cut. It was more like a slow, relentless drizzle that leaves a person chilled long before they realize they are soaked through. Many on the outside believed that once the marriage ended, Whitney would finally be free, that she would exhale, reclaim herself, and return to the version of Whitney the world missed. But according to people close to her, the reality was far harsher. Walking away from Bobby Brown did not bring the emotional release everyone had predicted. There was no triumphant, "it's finally over" moment. Instead, there was a vast, echoing emptiness. A silence so dense it felt disorienting. On paper, she was no longer tied to him. In her inner world, however, Bobby remained a massive, lingering shadow, quiet, persistent, and nearly impossible to erase. That shadow was not just the memory of a man. It was the imprint of an entire era of her life, a chapter where she had wagered everything: her trust, her identity, her stability. Friends who stayed by her side through the highs and the devastating lows later shared that even after the legal ties were severed, Whitney still spoke about Bobby in ways that did not fit neatly into categories like love or hate. Sometimes there was anger in her tone, other times just exhaustion. And in between those extremes, there was a heavy, hollow silence. Bobby Brown no longer appeared in her daily routine, but his influence held its ground in the architecture of her emotional life. For anyone who has survived a relationship that intense, this paradox is not hard to understand. When someone has been your emotional center for so long, their absence doesn't simply leave a blank space. It creates a kind of vortex. Some of Whitney's closest companions, who had watched her at her most radiant and at her most depleted, described something even more painful. In their view, Whitney's strongest anger was not aimed solely at Bobby. She was believed to be furious with herself, angry that she had trusted the idea that love alone could heal fundamental differences, angry that she had loved him so deeply she ignored early warning signs that now felt glaring, angry that she had surrendered so many pieces of who she was for a marriage that never gave her real peace in return. That anger did not pour out in dramatic press conferences or public rants. It turned inward, scratching away at the one person who had to carry it: Whitney herself. That kind of rage is the most dangerous because it has nowhere to go. There is no visible target, no confrontation to release it. It is crucial to state one clear point. There is no confirmed record of Whitney Houston ever standing in front of a camera or microphone and flatly declaring in direct terms that she hated Bobby Brown. What people think they know about her feelings comes mostly from Bobby's own memoirs accounts, shared by friends and colleagues, and the visible evolution of Whitney's behavior over time. Labeling her emotion as hatred is in many ways an interpretation, an attempt by outsiders to name something she herself never explicitly defined. But there are times when silence becomes a kind of confession. Whitney did not need to speak the word. The way she withdrew, sidestepped questions, and changed, when the past was mentioned, often spoke more loudly than any statement. By this stage, the negative emotions living inside her did not look like the out-of-control rage people imagined. Instead, they hardened into a kind of survival reflex, an armor forged from disappointment, trauma, and the terrifying fear of being hurt again. Family members said Whitney grew more guarded, more cautious, less willing to fully open herself in new relationships. This was not a natural coldness. It was the behavior of someone who had been worn down for far too long. When you have given so much without receiving safety in return, closing off doesn't feel like a decision. It becomes instinct. The most unsettling twist in this story is that the person Whitney was said to resent the most was the very person she had once loved, with an almost unmatched intensity. Powerful emotions do not simply die. They change shape. When love no longer has a place where it can survive, it doesn't just vanish, it often transforms into resentment. Not always because the other person is monstrous, but because it is agonizing to face the idea that you gave so much of yourself to someone who could not protect that gift. In Whitney's case, that resentment reportedly came with an added weight: the belief that she had betrayed herself, that she had drifted painfully far from the woman she had once been proud of. Bobby Brown became in many eyes the living symbol of all those losses, even if he was not solely responsible for them. There were nights, according to various accounts, when Whitney seemed desperate to stay away from any discussion of the past, yet found it nearly impossible to fully escape it. When Bobby's name came up, she might deflect, redirect, or reply with a faint, distant smile before letting the conversation die. To strangers, this may have looked like indifference. To those who knew her, it felt like the silence of a wound that had never closed. Whitney did not need to nurse an active grudge to keep going. What she needed was distance, enough emotional space to keep from being pulled back into the same vortex. In creating that distance, the feeling people called hate functioned less as a weapon and more as a last line of defense. The public often becomes fixated on assigning blame, deciding who was right and who was wrong. But beneath that surface level curiosity lies the deeper ache of the story. Whitney Houston was a woman, familiar with being admired, applauded, and placed on a pedestal. She was not prepared to face such a profound collapse in her private life. When her marriage crumbled, she didn't lose just a husband. She lost faith in her own judgment. The resentment she carried was no longer just about him. It became a message to herself, a harsh reminder that if she wanted to survive, she had to hold whatever was left of her together, no matter how much had already been torn away. That is why Bobby Brown's presence in her spiritual life remained so large even after lawyers, documents, and courts declared their union over. It wasn't a sign that she was weak. It was evidence of how deep the relationship had sunk into her. This story did not end with the divorce. The form of it simply changed. From that point on, emotions could no longer be neatly categorized. There was regret, resentment, grief, and a strange kind of loyalty to the memories that had shaped her. At the darkest point of this tragedy, Whitney Houston was not a woman destroyed by hatred. She was a woman clinging to that pain as a kind of life jacket to keep herself from going back, to keep from collapsing, to keep existing in a world that had taken almost everything from her and still expected her to smile as if nothing had shattered. In the years that followed, when the headlines began to quiet, and the relentless focus on her personal life slowly faded, what the world held on to most was not the scandal. It was the music. That voice still hung in the air, capable of sending chills through a person with just a single note. The recordings, the live performances, the moments when she set entire arenas on fire with her gift, those memories remained untouched. Whitney Houston continued to occupy a space in music that personal chaos could not erase. Yet running parallel to that brilliance was another kind of echo, low, heavy, and persistent. It was the echo of a relationship that split her life open like an earthquake, leaving cracks that never fully closed. In later interviews, Bobby Brown spoke about his regrets with a rough honesty that fit his character. He talked about being immature, about failing to understand the weight Whitney carried, and about all the ways in which he believed he had contributed to her suffering. These reflections were recorded, reported, and debated. Some people thought his remorse was sincere. Others doubted his motives. But the real point was not whether his regret arrived early or late. Regret has no power to rewrite the past. It only sharpens it. It makes the truth clearer, sometimes more painful, but never undone. For Whitney, that chapter gradually turned into a towering lesson, one that extended beyond her own life and spoke to anyone looking in. It was a lesson about the fragility of fame. Fame looks solid, almost invincible, but it cannot protect a person from the raw collisions that happen behind closed doors. Public adoration lights up a life, but it also throws every flaw into sharp relief. Every decision becomes a spectacle. Every mistake becomes a topic for global consumption. And in that arena, love is never just between two people. It is weighed against biases, expectations, and the unspoken rules placed on a black icon who had been allowed to cross into mainstream acceptance. Whitney did not simply choose the wrong man. She chose him at a time when every deviation from the script written for her carried a cost that was amplified 100 times. Their relationship stands as a stark reminder that love arriving at the wrong time under the wrong pressures can carve the deepest scars. Not because there is too little emotion, but because there is too much, and no safe place to hold it. When two people come together with unhealed injuries and unresolved fears, love cannot fix them. It magnifies everything. Whitney and Bobby did not lack intensity. They did not lack connection. What they lacked was a space where both could be fully themselves without destroying each other in the process. When that space does not exist, every attempt to hold on becomes another way to self-destruct. The emotion people later labeled as hate did not end in dramatic confrontations or public condemnations. It did not close with a clean final break. Over time, that emotion thinned into something quieter, a long wordless sorrow. Sorrow for what had been lost. Sorrow for what could have turned out differently if timing, maturity, and circumstances had aligned just a little sooner. That sorrow did not shout. It hovered like a constant musical undertone in the background of Whitney's life. It did not stop her from working. It did not erase her smile from the public eye. But it followed her a reminder of a story that never found a perfect ending. According to some who worked with her later on, Whitney rarely said Bobby's name directly. Not because she had forgotten him, but because she did not want to stir a storm she could no longer control. Her silence in those moments did not signal that she no longer cared. It was her way of moving forward without reopening wounds that had already cost her so much. Not speaking about the story did not mean the story was gone. It just sank deeper to a layer only she could feel, present every second, invisible to everyone else. Perhaps the cruelest truth is that Whitney never completely stepped out of that narrative, even when the spotlight shifted away from her personal life. She could leave the relationship behind. She could sign papers, move homes, change routines. But she could not erase what that love had altered inside her. Her choices, her sacrifices, her pain, all of it reshaped how she saw herself and the world. For a woman who had been watched by millions for most of her existence, carrying an unresolved private story was its own kind of exhaustion. When the curtain finally falls on Whitney Houston's life, what lingers is not only the triumphs, the hit songs, or the standing ovations. There is also regret, not the cheap kind, but a deeply human one. Regret for a woman who touched every possible peak, yet never found equal peace behind her own front door. Regret for a love so powerful it burned through everything around it, but never found the conditions needed to survive without destruction. Regret for a story that from afar can be reduced to gossip, but from the inside was a maze of emotions almost too complex to name. The loud arguments have faded. The public judgments have grown quiet. But the aftershocks remain. They live in the way people listen to her voice, now hearing not just technique, but the weight behind each note. They live in how we look at relationships that appear glamorous on the surface yet are soaked in shadows. And they live in the recognition that love does not always redeem. Sometimes the only thing it leaves behind is a lesson that is brutally expensive and impossible to forget. For Whitney Houston, that lesson never stopped echoing. It followed her, a quiet resonance that outlived the headlines, reminding us that behind every icon is a human being who has bled in ways no spotlight can ever completely conceal. The story of Whitney Houston and Bobby Brown is not meant to be a verdict or a simple accusation. It is a reflection, a mirror held up to show how fragile the human spirit becomes when love, fame, and the weight of public expectation collide all at once. Whitney is not remembered solely for her suffering, but that suffering is woven into her legacy. When people speak of hate in this narrative, the word itself matters less than the unresolved hurt beneath it, the lingering shock, the unhealed disappointment, the quiet grief of a woman who loved deeply and sacrificed more than the world ever truly understood. This story is not just about two celebrities. It reaches anyone who has ever loved at the wrong moment, anyone who has bargained away parts of themselves to keep a relationship from falling apart, anyone who has smiled at the world while slowly breaking inside. Whitney Houston became an icon not because her life was flawless, but because she showed in a hauntingly human way that even the greatest voices carry pain that never fully leaves. That is why her story continues to resonate long after the noise of gossip has died down and the judgment has grown cold. If you know someone whose life or personality mirrors this story, Share their name in the comments.